Welcome to the VO2 Lounge Coaching Podcast. If you are a returning listener and have not already done so, please feel free to rate and share the show wherever you get your podcasts from. It's the best way to support the show and allow it to reach more people. If you are a new listener, then welcome and enjoy this episode. If you would like to become an athlete at the VO2 Lounge Coaching, then email me at the vo2lounge@gmail.com. That's VO2 with the number 2, not written out 2. Or by going directly to my Training Peaks where you can register your interest there. Links, of course, are all down below, but for now, let's get into this episode. Okay, so as per the previous episode, a little update from me. I had my best crit result of the year this week, or probably last week, depending when this episode comes out, but I came 4th in that criterium. It's my local criterium, 50-minute crit. It was a 3-4 crit. For those who are in the UK, they'll understand that. In America, slightly different system, but 3-4 crit, 272 averaged power, 320 normalized, and 1200 peak. I've been questioning my decisions earlier in the year, how I came into the training. Did I have intensity soon enough? Was there enough volume? So on and so forth. There can always be more volume, but was there enough? And this race kind of gave me the security that 1, skills are definitely there, but 2, racecrafts coming along, but 3, that the power is clearly good enough. To be honest, coming into the race, so it's the first one. This is in Milton Keynes Bowl. If anyone listening has raced there before, this was the first week where they opened up the full course. The week before, it was just the circular course. They open up, and for those not aware with it, essentially you have a circular course that then opens up into a slightly more technical course. Depending on which way you're doing it, it plays out a bit differently, but in the direction where you were going, we were coming up the windy, sort of very gradually uphill section. But if you come into that section, you can hit it hard, and it really can string out the group quite a bit. I normally do end up, I feel like, doing more power on that course than just the oval. It's quite easy to stay in the wheels and allow a gap to almost form, and then as you come back down the hill, it's like a very gradual hill, but as you come back down it, you really pick up speed, and then you catch back onto the group really easily. The draft's so big and so beneficial that it works out better that way. Whereas when you're doing this course, it's a bit harder in a way to have such a low power, say like 220, 200. So I normally average more, but coming into it, wanted to test the legs, really smashing it, sitting near the front a lot, trying to string it out, testing some ideas I've had about how you could win this race, especially if you had a bigger group with you, like a team, whether you can just sit at the front, take turns, string it out, make it really hard. And drop people that way. It's easy enough if people have the technique to sit back on, but coming to the end of the race, I had been in a move for a little bit, maybe a group of 5. The main bunch caught back on, so that was done. From there, that will happen very close to the 5 laps to go, and so from there it was much more energy recovery, like just keeping it easy, because I figured now it's coming down to a bunch sprint. There's a E1, 2, 3 race on at the same time. People have been dispatched from there, and we ended up with a rider who just clearly just wanted to do some more work. Sat on the front for about 2 or 3 laps. He was just chuffing along. I got into second wheel behind this person, and then last lap he peeled off. And at this point I was like, okay, it's about a minute from here to the finish. And so I just gave it every bit I had. I was like, if I peel off now and end up like 6th, 7th, 8th, where am I going to re-enter? I may end up entering 10th wheel, fighting for 10th wheel. So I just thought, you know what, I'll make it as hard and fast as I can, so at least people coming to the line have had to work as well. By the time we come to the last bend, essentially there are only about 5 people behind me, or maybe 6, who will now be able to actually beat me to the line. Obviously 3 of those people did, hence why I came 4th. And part of that was positioning in the sprint. Part of it was just simply how much work I had done in that last lap, how much of a sprint I had left. That final sprint was about 950 watts for 5 seconds. I don't know what the full duration was, but that was kind of like the peak duration. So it wasn't much to what I think my PR is probably 1300-ish for 5 seconds when I'm far fresher, maybe an hour and a half into a ride, but not taxed through a race format. So it gave me that confidence. It showed me the potential now going forward, trying to get in breaks, but only if they formed, or letting other people do the attacking, taking it easier. You can definitely on this course be 10th wheel and just pedal almost all the corners, bar maybe 2, conserve energy as much as possible, and then come to the end and really spend your pennies on that final 5 laps to go, getting in a good position, getting there for the sprint. But great result for me, really chuffed with it. Moves me on to the goal that I set myself for the year of the Cat 2 license. Really, I would love to win a 3-4 crit or road race before moving on. But if the points come as they do in this fashion, may not be possible. But look, we still got to have that aim. That is the aim. Aim number 1 is to win. Aim number 2 will be to get the Cat 2 license, as I mentioned before. But anyway, let's move on from that and get on to the main topic of this episode, which is gonna move away a little bit from the traditional discussion that normally happens on this podcast, where I find a few papers, go through them, glean what we can from them, discuss it, so on and so forth. And it's just going to be me shooting from the hip. Very little prep for this. Basically wrote down the title topics that I will be discussing regarding to formulating a sort of pragmatic, practical approach to training for cyclists. This isn't time crunch, this isn't time heavy, this is just, is there an order to what's important / what should I be focusing on at what times, so on and so forth. But essentially we will discuss volume and zone 2 training in general, because really they kind of go hand in hand. Training frequency, so how many days should you train, intensity distribution, TSS and burnout, which go very well together, rest weeks, VO2 max training, threshold and sweet spot training, periodization, so I talk about block, traditional, sweet spot, for example, block and traditional, but then within that, training modalities, like for example, intensity distribution regarding people who use sweet spot, 80-20, strength training, which we've discussed. All of these things we, for the most part, in the podcast discussed before in a very diving into the minutiae style discussion, whereas this much more high level, much more pragmatic to some extent into what can you do with them. And then we'll add also some, in the threshold section, we'll talk about FTP testing and so on and so forth. But let's get into the episode. So let's start with volume, and really what I've personally found, what seems to be the case, and also the sort of discrepancy you find amongst discussions, because you've got so many platforms, particularly Trainer Road, in the sense that Zwift, I suppose, as a platform, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't really push the training agenda too much. It just happens to be this great interactive world that has training plans, has racing, and has all these things, but it is a application / training environment first. Whereas Trainer Road, with their podcast, AI training, and all the other additions, they are a training platform / plan building platform first. And obviously it's moved, and there's been challenges, and 80-20, the polarized training regime, has been introduced, and they've moved. They still have the sweet spot method of training, but it is heavily a indoor training / using a trainer, more effective. Say 1 hour indoors is equivalent to an hour and a half outdoors, and TSS being the model of volume determination more so than hours. Like, you look at the jumps between low, medium, and high, say being like, say, 3, 8, and 14 hours a week. If you're not looking at TSS and doing a bunch of, let's say, sweet spot work, isn't particularly like high volume. If you have low, medium, and high, and you present that to a pro, well, the only option there they have is the high. Yes, they do high volume, but they do 20 plus, for example. So the way to look at volume is more is, for the most part, better. Now, in low intensity, if you have 15 hours a week available and ask, should I be doing the 15 hours or should I be just doing 10? It's like, if it's a one-off week, or like even if it's a one-off week, to be honest, if you've just been training 3 hours a week and it's like, oh, I've got 15 hours a week to train, should I do that? It's like, yeah, build up to it, not just drop the 15 now and sail off into the sunset. No, build up to it. But volume really does kind of seem to be the plateau determinant. It's almost like it's telling you where your training ceiling's going to be. Not your genetic ceiling, because you'd have to train, say, 20, 30, 40, however many hours a week for however many years to really find that in an optimal fashion. Training, if you're doing something like 5 or 10 or 15 hours a week, that is going to determine where your ceiling's going to be. Now, there are people who, for example, I think it's perfectly normal to race at a race, see the people who do well, see the people who don't do well, just see the people who are on Strava who've raced with you and look at their training volume and then be like, well, that guy came fourth and does 16 hours a week. For the most part, even at a 2, 3, 4, like a regional A level, the people doing the frequent 15-hour plus a week tend to be the ones doing better. Now, you do find people winning crits, winning road races, doing 7 hours a week, but more often than not, those people I see doing that are older. So probably in the past, because I'm not looking back 5, 10 years, did either have a huge training history that has had high volume at times, or they have been training maybe for less than like 10, 15 years, maybe only 5 years, but they have at some point in the past, one, accumulated a lot of race knowledge, because racing isn't all about legs. It is important, but it's not all about legs. And really, those people then are leaning on that historic volume, because it seems to be, for the most part, that maintaining a level of fitness. For example, Jesse Coyle's video not on the Nero show, but he had a video showing him leading into nationals, and the training volume was big. Yeah, it was like 20 plus hour weeks. But, and he mentions it himself, this is not the norm. He goes from about 330 watt FTP to 400-ish. And we're not even talking ramp test, 20-minute test. We're talking he goes out and does a 1 hour ride, which he called like his sweet spot effort, at effectively that number, and he's taking that number as FTP. And then is doing like 3 hour rides at 300 plus as like a sort of big overreach / plateau breakthrough / whatever you want to call it ride. And that was all in the space of like 20 weeks, maybe 18 weeks, which is obviously not normal. You're not going to now yourself, if you have a FTP of like 280, just do 20-hour weeks for 15 weeks and suddenly have an FTP of 420 or something. No. But he's got the history of it, and now when he gives it that stimulus, it all comes back in rapid fashion. And then that goes the same for people who've got that training history. Maybe they do 10 hours a week and they get to like 370 rather than doing 20 and hit 400, which 370 is still enough to do loads of damage. But if you've never been there, doing 10 hours a week is unlikely, unless you got great parents, to get you that far. So the best way to look at volume to me is more is better. And zone 2, because zone 2 is such a big thing at the moment, and the discussion about having a conversation but it being labored, and LT1, so this whole 2 millimole discussion. So for those, I'll keep it brief, but LT1, LT2, you'll have probably heard them before when you're talking about lactate testing. Essentially, LT1's that first kind of inflection. It's where it kind of starts to rise, not exponentially, I suppose you could say, but it does start to rise. And something I didn't realize is because it's up to it's not like a algorithm, I suppose. It is a semi-subjective / calibrated result of where you deem that as being rising at a faster rate or so on. And then LT2 being that real big inflection point, which some people refer to being close to FTP or around that kind of steady state, upper steady state effort. That eventually you'd capitulate, you'd run out of glucose or whatever, but that's LT2. Now, doing it at LT1 is hard work. And if you are, I think even if you're doing 10 hours a week, just the zone 2 stuff, just pretend you're going out for double the duration you're actually going out for. If you're going out for 4 hours, pretend you're going to have to be all right for 8, and just zone out, let it feel if you got a 400 watt FTP and you're averaging 140, yeah, that's too easy. But if you got a 300 watt FTP off a ramp test, you don't even want to be averaging 200 watts really on your leisurely ride, unless the whole ride's uphill, and in which case, why are you doing your endurance ride uphill for like 4 hours? Just take it easy. The idea of this part of your training is, I always like to come to a session like, what is the stimulus? Like, what is it? And zone 2 training, the stimulus is not how close can you be to tipping out of zone 2. It's not really the intensity here that we're yes, it is to some extent, in the sense that, say you're at 65% of FTP, that is an intensity, but it's not that if you're at 60% versus 63% or 64%, that it's an issue. The issue is if you go out on an endurance ride and you do 1.5 hours because you're at LT1 and you've cooked yourself, versus doing an endurance ride at, I don't know, 1.5 millimole and doing it for 4 hours. The duration is the stimulus. That is what is going to result in the beneficial stimulus down the road. Now, volume can be periodized, because for most of us, we have jobs, we have other things to do. Maybe we've got childcare responsibilities, maybe we've got whatever we've got. So volume can be periodized, and don't think that if you do 10 hours a week, it means on the week that you have a free entire weekend, and normally you'd only fit 2 3-hour rides or 1 4-hour ride, you've got both days free, you're not doing anything, doesn't mean now you have to stick to 10 hours a week. Those weeks you can then just up the volume. And if you're doing this work at a low enough intensity, then it should become easy. Yes, maybe your fit's off, but if you got some kind of pain in that sense, that is not fine, but as in, it doesn't mean you've overreached, in the sense of getting round a zone 2 ride should not necessarily, if you're listening to this and you are actually training, then you should be past the point where just going out and doing a 3-hour ride is the challenge. It should be being able to do back-to-back 3-hour, 4-hour rides that accumulate into a training block that is, I don't know, an average of 14 hours a week, or 10 or 8 or 7 or whatever it is. So know that, to cap it off, when it comes to volume, that essentially is going to be the determinant of where your ceiling is. The lower the volume, the earlier you're probably going to run into the ceiling. So you just started, maybe you've been riding for 2 years, messing about, now you're taking it seriously, you're doing a structured training plan. If you're doing 6 hours a week, maybe you'll plateau after like midway through year 2, like the beginning of year 2, you get back to the previous level you were and you don't get any better. Maybe 10 hours a week, you plateau after 2 years, 15, 4 years, 20, maybe you plateau after 8 years, and then you do 30 and the plateau stays the same, and you're like, okay, you can probably say this is very close to your genetic potential. But volume, zone 2, keep it easy, do as much of it as you can. So off the back of volume, because this is kind of, these two things go hand in hand, is frequency. How often should you ride? So my opinion on this has sort of changed a little. So I used to go with, I just ride, basically intend to ride every day. And if something happens, I then don't ride, right? So it helps me miss less days and it helps me get more volume in. So like maybe I might go like 10 days without a rest day. My reason my opinion on this has changed is, one, I think utilizing, say, as a non-professional person with a job, I think 5 days is kind of like the, okay, if you do 6 on one day, on 1 week, fine. But I think 5 is a great number to build to and maintain for the most part, because it's enough days that to get in, say, a 15-hour week, you're not doing like 9-hour rides or something ridiculous. Like if you're doing 3 days of training and trying to hit 10 or 15 hours a week or 20 hours a week, for example, whatever it is, whatever the number is, the rides become huge. It's enough where you can have 2 longer rides and 2 intensity rides, and then just like a kind of bridge ride. You've got 2 days off where you can sort out bits of your life and other things and remain mentally fresh and sort stuff out. And then if the opportunity comes up to do the 6th day, you can drop it in. But I think it gives enough recovery in general to keep the quality of the high intensity sessions there and keep them high, which is important. And it also keeps the freshness there psychologically and physically to then go and do your longer rides when the time comes to do them. By all means, if you're able to do 6 days a week, it doesn't really impact life that much. You're able to hit 2 high intensity days in your build phase and hit, say, Saturday, Sunday with big volume days or a massive volume day on the Saturday or whatever it is. Then by all means, it's still great. But I personally think the 5-day model is great. You've got you could also approach it by a 3-day on, 1 day off model where you some weeks obviously you're doing 6 days because of where everything lines up, but then other weeks you're only doing 5 days. Now, if you're going to stick to the 5-day model, then like for example Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is a 3-day block, Monday, Friday off, and then you can do Saturday, Sunday, for example, is a good idea. Now, it obviously again changes depending on your responsibilities, and if you have a lifestyle where you know it can be a bit sporadic, then maybe just doing the logic I had before where you suggest that you ride every day, and it means maybe you ride 6 days in a row and then you get to day 7 and you were meant to ride, but something comes up, you know you can drop it because you've already got 10 hours in and that was just going to top you up to like 13 or 14. So those are the ways I think frequency can be played. Training frequency within the same day, for example. The double days I personally use purely because I commute to work. It's a 45-minute commute. It means I can get an hour and a half in each day. Is it more beneficial to do the hour and a half in one ride? Probably from a stimulus and a rest perspective. It probably is. It definitely is from a rest perspective because you've got bigger gaps between like workouts, and psychologically it's probably easier. But because I'm commuting, it's kind of, if it just fits in, where if I were to not do the double day, this is the reality. If I were to be professional, I wouldn't split a 4-hour ride into 2 2-hour rides. But if I'm who I am and I'm commuting by car, and that takes 25 minutes rather than the 45 minutes, then when I come home, am I going to do an hour and a half ride in the morning or in the afternoon, probably less likely to do it, to be honest, compared to just going to work by bike, coming back. I can tag volume on if I fancy, and then sometimes a week I end up doing a ride with a group from work because I've already got my bike there. I'll do 2 hours, and now I've done a 2-hour ride and the 45-minute ride, and essentially once it all rounds up, it's probably a 3-hour day. Happy day. So frequency, I think, building up to 5 days is the point at where I think more is better. After 5 days in a given week, if we're just looking at it as a 7-day block, that's where you can start to go, do I really need these days? Depending on what your volume looks like. I think as a professional individual, as in a working professional, non-cycling professional, really do think about these recovery days, and especially if you are having to get up early for your commute. Like, for example, I'm getting up at 6 rather than, say, 7. It can be a good idea to have 2 of those work days as rest days, because now you can get up at a normal hour. So that's where I am on frequency. Frequency, the more frequent, the better. If you're at 2 days a week, 3 is better than 2, 4 is better than 3, 5 is better than 4, and then 6... we're now getting into recovery as the question. So be pragmatic about it. Bear in mind that if you're on that 6th day, you're just going out for an hour. Say you're already riding 10 or 15 hours a week, and you add an extra day and you just go out for an hour. That better be for a reason. That better be you're riding with like your partner, a good friend that you can't ride with in one of your other days. It better not just be you going out for an hour. Unless it's so regenerative or whatever, there's probably better things you can be doing, because the hour of getting dressed, going for the ride, on the other end, all that kind of stuff, you probably could be doing something better, right? If it's a 4-hour ride and you need to do 6 hours to do your 20-hour week, completely different story. You probably don't need my assistance there. But if it's just to add 1 hour, it's like, what is the stimulus here? Question yourself, what is the stimulus? Is this a social benefit, or is this just purely a detriment for your home life, work life, every other kind of life? Ask yourself that question. Is this necessary? Right, the next one I thought about discussing, because it again feeds directly sort of into volume, is TSS. And it's a metric that I've ummed and ahed about a lot, and I've never really had, because up until this point I've never properly done FTP testing, which we'll get onto in a moment, in a method that I deemed valid. So I never kept my FTP up to date on my Wahoo, for example, or any of my training platforms, because I didn't really trust the actual FTP number, and therefore didn't trust the TSS. However, with people who have used it and have tracked it, and even people that I've spoken to and have said, you know what, for your TSS, if you are going to look at it and you've got an FTP from a ramp test, just take like 20 watts off that FTP, probably, because I don't know how accurate it is. But TSS, the problem with it, to me, is that obviously, a bit like what I think they do say on the Train and Road podcast, is that not all TSS is the same. I think working on a TSS model of, like, say you're trying to hit 800 TSS a week, trying to hit that through like capping your volume and just adding intensity, I think that's what it can lead people to do. And you have to ask yourself the question of, can you recover from that? How big's the hole that you're digging? What is the end goal? Which is probably FTP increase. But I followed similar plans to, I've followed various different models of training, and when I try to up TSS in particular and the intensity and cap my hours, it often leads to burnout, really. Just cooking yourself from the psychological strain of doing 3 rides a week where you're doing over-unders, threshold, and bloody VO2, when I went through that state, my thoughts to myself while doing it was like, man, I've got to do this for the next 10 years. Because in my head, I'm like, I want to ride my bike for the next 10 years. Like, the life cycle of my previous sport which was rugby, was about 10 years, really. 2010 to 2020, basically. It's 10 years, right? Could I do this for 10 years? No. It was horrible. It was terrible. And as soon as I left that sort of method of training and just went to, I ride way more now. I mean, like 10 hours is probably a regular. Hitting a 10-hour week just usually means that I probably haven't raced too much. I haven't been trying to recover, and I've just had a solid-ish week of training, really. Whereas following those sort of plans, I'd be training for 3 hours and be cooked. And you see the plateau come on again, because really the intensity isn't the thing holding you back. The overall volume you're training to is holding you back. The intensity is just realizing what you've built. Essentially, it's showing you that actually you could hold 340 watts, not 300, that you are currently able to hold because you're just doing some moderate intensity and some zone 2 work. So TSS, I think, really, I personally ignore. I don't base anything off it. Burnout, I think, coincides heavily with the amount of intensity, whether that's too much racing, whether that's too much high intensity work, whether that's too much high intensity work for too long. And segueing into rest weeks, the way I look at a rest week is, if you're sub 10 hours, you probably don't need to actively plan them, because you will inevitably come across a week where you can't train as much as you normally can. And you just go, okay, rather than trying to rag myself in, like, just pummel myself into the ground with whatever it is, work stress, life stress, plus the stress of training, and then come out the other end and be like, I've got loads of time now, but I can't use any of it because I'm so burnt out from the previous week. You just go, this is a rest week. I'm going to sleep more. I'm going to train when it's suitable. I'm probably not going to do any intensity, and I'm just going to use the bike as my relaxation. Maybe you still manage 5 hours, but it's just 1 hour rides, or 2 2-hour rides and a 1 hour ride, right? And they're all low intensity. And then you come back the next week and you're like eager to train because you haven't ridden as much as you normally do. You haven't done any intensity, and you've just got over a big block of some other kind of stress. So you're all excited to ride. Now, if you're doing 20 or 30-hour weeks, it's completely different. Maybe you have one after 2 weeks. Maybe you have one after 3 weeks. But that is a completely different discussion for the most part. And for the most part, rest weeks are, for us mere mortals, are an opportunity to deload the body from high intensity work and possibly sleep more if training is somehow getting in the way of it. And that's not to mean that you're getting up at 4 a.m. or something to train and so you're getting less sleep. I think if you're doing that, you probably need to reevaluate things. But what I mean more in the sense of, if you're doing a 2-hour ride, that's 2 hours that you're not doing other things, and it may mean that you get 8 hours, but if you're not doing that 2-hour ride, maybe now you have 9 hours to sleep, for example. So it's working on those kind of things during the rest week. It's not just the fact that you're not riding as much. It's just shedding your body of fatigue, bringing on the adaptions you've worked on, freshening up for another block of training. And so you can use them when you're on lower volume. But if you're doing 3 hours a week, you don't need to program a rest week. You just carry on training until life gets in the way and you can't train, essentially. So that's TSS, burnout, and rest weeks, in my opinion, really. So on to intervals and really, you've got threshold, sweet spot, you've got VO2 max training. Let's start with VO2 max work, which by its very name, you're trying to increase your VO2 max, your maximal oxygen uptake, which the ceiling of which is going to be determined by how much volume you've done and so on and so forth, and the adaptations you've created to facilitate that delivery of oxygen to the working muscle and be utilized, essentially. So, VO2 max. I think it's a good point to make on this type of training is that, one, the adaptations seem to come on fairly quickly. Like even week on week, you can see the process happening of you being able to hold a greater power figure. When you see intervals written out like 30-30s, 40-20s, 4 on, 4 off, 4 minutes is probably the upper end of a VO2 max effort. For a trained person, you've also got 2 minutes. They will usually prescribe, say, an upper end of like a 40-20 of being 120% of FTP. You just use it as a guide. Really, this is a good example of where being in tune with RPE and your own body is pretty key, because essentially all you're trying to do here is just basically flat out. It is as hard as you can go for the duration. And if you're doing 40-20s and you're doing 8 of them, it's just the hardest you can go for those 8 efforts. If you're doing a 4-minute effort, it's just go flat out for the 4-minute effort, but be able to do still the other 4, say you're doing a 4x4 or whatever. As you've probably guessed from this, the stimulus for VO2 max training is really the intensity. So this is unlike threshold that we'll come into in a bit, and unlike zone 2, where you're aiming to just increase the amount of time in zone. Obviously, initially, that is going to be the case. Maybe at the beginning, you can only do 5 minutes worth of VO2 work and you're blown out the water. 20 minutes, 21 minutes, that kind of range for a workout is really going to be the where you kind of stop at. And if you've been doing it properly and you've trained and you've built up to that point, you're probably going to hit that number and feel pretty hard. Like you're going to feel like you're pretty cooked. Like you're not going to want to do another few intervals. So that's a good point to stop. But essentially, week on week, you're going to be looking at how those numbers in the flat out effort are improving, and hence why it kind of drops off fairly quickly. Like you don't need a 20-week VO2 block. Maybe 4 weeks before your race season begins, or 4 weeks before the key race, maybe you dump in like 4 weeks of VO2 work and you get your results out. Like it doesn't need to be something you continuously do over the course of like 20, 30, 40 weeks. It's just not necessary. So VO2 max training is easy in that sense. The intensity is a stimulus. 1 workout a week is enough, and cap it at about 20-ish minutes. And you've probably done your VO2 max work successfully. So moving on from VO2 max, we'll talk about threshold, sweet spot, and FTP testing, because really you can do VO2 max work without knowing your FTP really easily, even if you're not that in tune with your body, because the intervals are so short. They can be poorly paced, but I feel like people have a better grasp on what they can do for a minute than what they can do for 20 minutes twice. So 2x20, for example. So yeah, FTP testing, threshold work, sweet spot work. Let's talk about that. So threshold, sweet spot, these kind of training zones get thrown around a lot. The argument in some cases, sweet spot is this Goldilocks training zone where it's like not too hard, not too easy. You can do loads of volume of it. If you just train there, you get huge FTP, you get loads of gains. If you're a time crunch cyclist, you train here a lot of the time and get big TSS volume and improve your cycling that way. To be honest, threshold and sweet spot kind of almost really, they're so close. I mean, okay, well, we get, and I've literally got the book in front of me, Training and Racing with a Power Meter, a 3rd edition by Hunter Allen, Andrew Coggan and Stephen McGregor. in page 73, there is a table 5.2, and you've got these 7 training zones. You've actually got 9, but they've put 4A and 4. 1 recovery, 2 endurance, 3 tempo, 4A sweet spot, 4 FTP. So by the fact that they've got them so close together, kind of shows how they are so similar. Sweet spot being 88 to 95%, threshold being 95 to 105% of FTP. Now, FTP, functional threshold power, you got so many definitions of it being like an hour power, these sort of things like steady state, quasi-steady state. I think they reference it as a quasi-steady state in this book. FTP, it's kind of just a training metric, but I think the way at which people obtain it is a little dubious. With things like, the shorter the test is, I think the worse and greater the over prediction for the most part. Like an 8-minute test, how can you infer hour or accurate sort of training intervals based on 8-minute? I don't know. The ramp test, at least for me, way over predicts what I should actually be doing. 20-minute test, there's obviously the pacing element, but I think it's a much fairer representation. And then on the Empirical Cycling podcast, they had an episode, and I was just listening to it sort of passively, and then they mentioned their own sort of protocol. So let me get this up, and I think this is actually quite an interesting and good way of going about it. And the extra little gem that I think was in there was doing this blind. And I think maybe even doing a 20-minute test blind is a good idea. Because, again, okay, let me get what the protocol is out the way. So their protocol is the sort of baseline test, which is about 35 to 45 minutes long. It's 10 minutes at 92 to 95% of your target FTP. So basically, sweet spot E. Is it sweet spot? It's it's essentially sweet spot. And then from there, you've got you increase to 100% of your FTP after 10 minutes. So FTP for 15 minutes. And then between 10 and 15 minutes, you gradually increase the power until exhaustion. Now, I suppose you could do it a bit like a ramp test, where every minute you just consciously make the decision to add maybe 5-10 watts or whatever. I don't really know how exactly is best to go about that, because if you're at FTP and you do 20 watts extra, you're probably going to blow up. I don't know. Probably 10 watts every minute, 20 watts every minute, somewhere in that range. But this seems to be a good, especially for, I think, someone coaching someone, because you will be able to see clearly time to exhaustion as well, which they discuss, and you can see that improvement as well as the overall FTP. And then you just take an average of that whole block, and that is your FTP. The problem is FTP comes with a lot of like cojones swinging. Like, people want to have a bigger number, but if your goal is to just improve as an individual, then you need a number that you can work to. If you're very good at knowing your body and RPE, then almost to some extent FTP can be just done off feel. This range, doing FTP intervals is a bit like doing zone 2. The time in zone is what you're looking to really overload here. It doesn't matter if your FTP's actually 5 watts or 10 watts higher than what you're doing these FTP intervals, assuming, say, your FTP is at 300 or something. If you're doing these FTP intervals at 300 rather than 310, that's better than doing them at 320 when your FTP is 310, for example. Because the idea is that you're just increasing this total time in zone. That is the stimulus for an improvement in FTP and threshold in general, and increasing your time to exhaustion. And two ways of looking at FTP is, one is what the number is, and two, how long can you actually hold it. So arguably you could get it up to 340 on a ramp test, but if you can only hold 340 for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, then it's kind of useless. So the typical training for these like workouts, the typical ones are 2 by 20 minutes. And something I found this, especially when using training platforms, that I dreaded the 2 by 20 minutes because my FTP was way too high. Doing these 20-minute FTP intervals was not feasible in the slightest. So when you're doing these FTP intervals, it should actually feel incredibly manageable. Like maybe in the beginning, you're doing 2 by 15, for example, and after the second one, you're like, yeah, that was hard. I don't want to do a third one. But it shouldn't be that 5 minutes in, you're like, whoa, we're in for a long day here. It should actually be quite a manageable effort. And the sweet spot is almost like the sort of the transition through. It's like maybe start off when you're less maybe trained and can hold your FTP for less time, you do sweet spot. And then as you're dragging out these sweet spot intervals and you've now got like say 2 30-minute blocks, then you progress on to the threshold stuff. And then you're doing the same thing. 2 by 20 is the like standard. Then you can just add by like a block of 20, a block of 25, 2 25s, 2 30s, 2 40s, or then at that point you can add 3 20s and increase that total time. As to total duration, I think it's 60 minutes of FTP work is probably a pretty... Obviously, you could have an FTP of 330, be able to do 3 blocks of 330, but not hold it for the entire block, because obviously you've got that recovery. The recovery intervals can be 5 minutes. They can be pretty short blips of just clearing waste product, getting lactate back down, maybe a bit of a psychological break, so on and so forth, and then right back at it. You cardiac drift during this session, really it shouldn't be running away from you, your heart rate, as per the whole threshold thing, stuff should be pretty steady here. But these I think are really where people are going to see great improvement, especially if you're like doing sportives, time trials, and even racing. These threshold exercises, like these workouts, aren't glamorous in the sense that you're not going to get like as big a bump in as short an amount of time as doing some VO2 work. No, your FTP is not going to jump by like 30 or something crazy. Obviously, untrained people completely different, but you're not going to get as big a bump. What you are going to get, and what I've gained from these in the build up to the race season, is now I can come right up to that sort of limit, hold that let's say 280 watts for the first 2 laps of a road race, average that, and then when it eases off and then there's little jabs, rather than just completely falling apart as soon as the race accelerates again, I've recovered while sitting at 230 watts or something, and aerobically just way more effective at dealing with such a high load, high stimulus, and so on and so forth, which obviously comes from this base of zone 2 work, but this threshold work is gonna develop that upper aerobic prowess essentially. Now, deviating a little bit, because I've mentioned RPE and being able to feel out workouts, and I think when the last episode I did on the Norwegian method of training, there was a snippet in there where they discussed the fact that the Norwegian athletics body, I think it was, had this idea of that Europeans weren't capable of effectively RPE as well as these Kenyans were. These Kenyans could train at these optimal intensities, at these prescribed intensities naturally, whereas Europeans needed technology to educate them, and lactate was their method of saying, look, these Kenyans are running at this millimole amount. We need to educate you what that feels like, so we need you to run to get the feedback, and then for you to now learn this is what it feels like. And I think that in cycling, power meters have really done that. The idea is even a little experiment. For your first interval, ride it with power and use the power meter. Say you're doing a 2x20, use the power meter to hit your watts. Next interval, hide the power figure. So maybe if you've got your bike computer, maybe have time, heart rate, or time, power, and heart rate. And then on the second interval, zoom in so you've just got time, because I'm not expecting you to learn how to know exactly how long you've been exercising for, and see how close you can get to that power based purely on feel. And I think that is the biggest thing that power meters give us. It's not the pacing, it's not all this nuance. It gives you two things. One, if you've got a datum point, which is the same power meter every single time you're riding, and if you change, you make a note of the offset that you've clearly seen in your power figures, and the ability to calibrate your brain and legs and neuromusculature to what is maximal, submaximal endurance, and getting to the point where you can go out for an endurance ride. You're not looking at one bit at your power meter, but every single ride you come back and you've averaged essentially the same power, similar normalized, and maybe heart rate fluctuates based day to day, but you've managed to do that. And then you go out on a threshold session and you hit 3 intervals, and your power meter's kind of just there to log it for you. You know exactly what's going on. And I think, again, tying into the VO2 max sessions, which were easier to do because they're just sort of all out, whereas there's an element of feel that comes from it. And I think learning that feel is so crucial and helps you pace everything. It helps you pace attacks. It helps you pace sportives. It helps you pace just casual, right? Especially when you become fitter and then you're meeting new people who aren't, and you're trying to pace them around for like an event or something. You're just using it as a training, pacing that, having a feel of what is the correct pace for that person, even through your own kind of experience. So I think that's threshold, that's sweet spot. FTPs, I think, for the broad part, anyone with a ramped FTP, take 20 off it. Just like start doing your threshold workouts at like, obviously that's proportional, so there's probably a percentage tie-in, but I think look up the empirical cycling FTP tests, and they've got an article going through why they deem 20-minute and ramp tests and so on to be over predicting, and try out their tests and try them blind, because I think that could be quite beneficial for a lot of people, because it is your FTP. So doing this test and being like, that's quite a long time to hold sweet spot for 10 minutes, then threshold for 15, and then gradually ramp for another 10 to 15. Well, if the number you're trying to hold, you can't even do the first 25 minutes, then it's not your threshold. And so this will, I think, cast a light onto truly where you are, and in the long term you will benefit greatly from having a correctly set threshold that you can progress the amount of time in zone with, you can build upon, and you can see performance improvements. No EFTP, no ramp test. 20-minute test, I still think is still a perfectly valid test. It's much more aerobic obviously a ramp test is, but it's a much fairer representation. And especially as an individual, what's good about that, again, I always caveat with, if you're an experienced individual and 20-minute test, I'm using it as a benchmark tool. I am not actually 95% of that for my hour. My hour is actually like 93%. Great. But for the person who's uninitiated, taking this test where it's just an average of the power and not a percentage multiplier or whatever, I think it's a really good move. and it's something to give a go. So training periodization and intensity distribution are two, again, critical things that you got to consider. Problem is, there are conflicting views in the sense that block periodization is going to have all these amazing gains compared to standard methods of periodization of just building through the year and entering race season and so on and so forth. I think for most individuals, you're going to be doing some kind of hybrid approach. When you build out your plan, it's probably going to be traditional periodization of a base phase, a building phase, and then a racing phase. Now, where block periodization comes into there is like, if you know, in March I'm going to book a cycling holiday, then that's technically a form of block periodization. You know you're going to get this big overload, so you plan a sort of rest week afterwards and a less intense week the week before. And then if you through your training plan, if you get a week where you know you can do more volume, you do it. What I would stay away from is, as an amateur, actually using block periodization as the primary method, because it's just too vulnerable to outside factors out of your control, like stressors and missed weeks. Whereas just a standard building periodization where it just gradually builds and builds and builds, if you miss a week, you're not missing your key week, you're not stressing about that, and it's just easier to manage. As for intensity distribution, there's obviously loads of stuff out there about 80-20. I don't think people have to be as polarized as that, in the sense of stressing about, I only train. If you train 30 hours or 20 hours a week, then you're naturally going to end up being in that category, because you can't do 5 or 8 hours of pure intensity. Whereas if you are only on 3 hours a week, then maybe one or even two of your rides are going to have intensity in them, because there's enough time for you to recover, and the rest of the time you're just using as zone 2. So with the training approach, it's not every ride obviously should be intense. It should be polarized in the sense the work you're doing is polarized, in the sense they are clearly defined. It's not just a mess of random power outputs and tempo here, sweet spot, just all sorts of stuff going on. There should be a clear defined purpose to each ride, but the exact intensity distribution less important. When you're getting into that build phase, focusing on, am I recovering coming into this next interval session? There's no point having a VO2 session and 2 days later having a threshold session, if now your threshold session you're holding like 30 watts less than you should be, because you're too cooked from the VO2 session, or the VO2 session you're actually doing 40-20s at threshold. Like, there's no point. You need to make sure that you're coming into it and you can do what the stimulus needs to be. Like, you're within the band of the training intensity, and you're also able to do the duration. Like 40-20s, you come and do 3 or 4 rather than the 8, because you're just too cooked. Take the day and do zone 2 instead. So it should naturally happen. Cap yourself at maybe 2 days of intensity a week. Make sure you've got plenty of recovery coming into them. The stuff in between, volume, essentially adding on volume, and doing your volume day after the intensity day is probably a better distribution, because you should just be tapping it out really on the longer day. So it's not necessarily that you need to design this program that is exactly 80-20 split of high intensity, low intensity, or whatever. It's just that make sure easy stuff is really easy. Make sure there's a lot of it, or as much as you can get, and make sure you're progressively overloading both the low intensity and the high intensity, and that you're hitting the training zones. Make sure you're doing that. And then the training intensity distribution and periodization of all that should figure itself out if you're just being moderately pragmatic about things. And finally, I thought I'd add a section on strength training. This can be really simply encompassed, and that is that obviously most cyclists I meet are, at least most career, if you're new to the sport, then, and you've had some kind of previous gym background, then really you've probably got enough lean mass on you that this is less of a problem, that you're needing to put more on to either put out bigger power numbers or whatever. My recommendation in general is, if you're just looking to be a healthier human being, then balancing everything is good, and getting your strength training work in, possibly even putting it on the same day as an intensity day. So like you do your, say, a VO2 session in the morning, weights in the evening. Otherwise, you just have to know yourself and don't bury yourself. I tend to hit the off season. I usually have a week of doing nothing, then a week of just maybe I get on the bike, maybe I don't, but then I'm probably going to the gym, and then all the way through till like January, I'm doing both upper and lower body work, and then hit January, and as soon as the threshold comes in, I'm spacing the lower body stuff as quite far away from the threshold work, and it's transitioning away from like hypertrophy based training to strength based training, like a lower weight, to try benefit my sprint later on. And then once we get into the proper build phase, the gym's going and it's just upper body work. And then in the race season, it's a sporadic approach to upper body stuff, just here and there, keeping some mass on. And I also find it makes me more comfortable on the bike. I'm better able to support myself and hold aero positions and stuff like that. It just makes me feel better. And when I go to do stuff in life, it's not taxing as it would be if I'm doing no gym work. So that's the recommendation, really. From a performance benefit, there isn't loads of work that really shows that this is beneficial. You've probably got enough lean mass on you. If you've ridden your whole life and never been into the gym, just get a bit done in the winter season and then taper it out, and then just do bits and top up sessions here and there. And that's probably the best way to do it. The other things, if you're doing them all well, you're training 20 hours a week, you're doing near to the race season 20 minutes of VO2 and 65, 70 minutes of threshold, then going into the gym and smashing deadlifts and squats. What here is really pushing the needle? Like, it's not the squats or the deadlifts. It's the VO2, the threshold, and the 20 hours of cycling you're doing a week. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Just do it from a health perspective. And if you're a sprinter or looking to increase your sprint, then end of the kind of base phase, getting in some heavy lifts, working on your sprint at the same time, that can teach you to utilize and build some strength from the hypertrophic gains you've gained earlier in the year. But that brings us to the end of the episode. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating, and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at the VO2lounge@gmail.com or the VO2 Lounge Discord server. Links all down below. And again, as I said in the beginning, if you would like to become an athlete at the VO2 Lounge Coaching, then either email the VO2lounge@gmail.com or go directly to my Training Peaks account where you can register your interest. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.